You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 315, The Evacuation of Savannah. We return this week to the South, where the final contest for Georgia plays out in the summer of 1782. General Nathanael Greene commanded the main Southern Army in South Carolina, still trying to dislodge the British from Charleston. General Anthony Wayne brought the Pennsylvania line to South Carolina following the victory in Yorktown, Virginia. Greene kept the Continental reinforcements, but he sent General Wayne to take command of the local forces in Georgia. When Wayne arrived in Georgia in January of 1782, he brought only with him about 100 dragoons from the Pennsylvania line and a small detachment of field artillery. He also had about 300 mounted South Carolina soldiers who had been fighting under General Sumter, as well as another 170 volunteers. The British force in and around Savannah was more than twice the size of Wayne's force. The British commander was General Alured Clark. Now, his rank is questionable. I've read some sources that say he was a brigadier by this time. Others say he was still a lieutenant colonel. It's possible that he held a temporary rank of brigadier in America. It's just not clear from what I've read. In any event, though, he was the ranking officer in charge of British troops in Savannah. The other leader there was, of course, Royal Governor James Wright. He had been governor since 1760 and had led the colony up until the time he was arrested in 1776 and had to flee to a British warship. At that point, Wright returned to London, where he lobbied for an invasion, and that invasion, of course, took place in December of 1778, when the British took at least partial control of the colony once again. By July 1779, Wright was back in Savannah. He tried to retake control of the entire colony, but it really ended up getting reduced to the area right around Savannah. In addition to the 1,200 or so regulars, the British also had around 500 loyalists under the capable leadership of Thomas Burnfoot Brown, someone I've discussed many times in previous episodes. Brown was probably the most dogged officer in fighting to keep Georgia British. The British also had good ongoing relations with the Creek Indians, whom they hoped might still come to their assistance. Wayne found his Continental forces hopelessly outnumbered. He hoped to raise an army of local militia, but found that almost impossible. The Patriot government, which was set up in Augusta, was proving completely useless. The Georgia population at this point was pretty sparse to begin with, and locals did not seem eager to volunteer for more military service. Wayne also wrote to Greene in South Carolina, pleading for more soldiers, including perhaps his Pennsylvania line, which he had brought down from Virginia. Greene rejected his requests, believing that he needed all his soldiers to challenge the British garrison at Charleston. So Wayne tried to get creative. He convinced the Patriot governor, John Martin, to issue amnesty for any loyalists who would be willing to join the Patriots. That accomplished almost nothing. Wayne reported that 1 officer and 15 soldiers showed up for the amnesty, but that was about it. Lacking sufficient troops to attack Savannah head-on, or even really besiege it, Wayne had to satisfy himself with keeping the British bottled up in Savannah and cutting off communications with any loyalists who were still in other parts of the state, or probably more importantly, the Creek Indian allies of the British. Wayne spread out his men over 25 miles. They would have been spread too thinly to withstand any large sustained attack, but that wasn't really the goal. They were there to prevent supplies or messages from passing easily between the British and the rest of the state. Beyond that, Wayne used his cavalry to raid the outskirts of Savannah to burn forage that might be of use to the enemy. Wayne faced his first real conflict in February when Creek and Choctaw warriors probed the Continental lines, looking for a weak spot to break through and enter Savannah. For several days, the Indians would attack various points along the line, only to be driven back by stubborn enemy fire. Wayne stayed awake for most of these days, riding up and down the lines to place reinforcements where needed and to encourage the men to hold their lines. Their goal wasn't to advance or retreat, simply keep the enemy from getting through their lines. Eventually, the Indians attempted to deploy riflemen on both the right and left flanks of the American lines, while also attacking in force at the center. They hoped to stir enough confusion to punch a hole through the lines and finally get into Savannah. Wayne's scouts, however, detected the movements and attacked the Indians before they could get into position. Wayne reported that he killed or captured a large number of Indians, as well as supplies that they were attempting to bring to the British in Savannah. Perhaps a dozen Indians made it through the lines to Savannah, but most of them simply withdrew. Wayne did treat his captive Indians pretty well. He tried to convince them that the war was essentially over, the British in Savannah would not be there much longer, and things would go worse for them if they did not make peace with the Americans before the war ended. Having sent this message to them, he permitted many of his captives to return home and spread the news around in an attempt to get local tribes to stop supporting the British. And when the British had discovered that their Indian allies had been repulsed, their response was to send Loyalist Colonel Thomas Burnfoot Brown to lead a force of Loyalists and a few Indians out of Savannah to challenge the Continental lines. The Loyalists attacked with 3 companies of infantry and 1 company of cavalry, and headed by a vanguard of Creek and Seminole warriors. After receiving word of the enemy advance, General Wayne assembled a light corps of his own and marched 4 miles at night to set up an ambush. Wayne's Continentals hit the vanguard column of the Loyalists during their night march, shooting flares and attacking both sides of the column as they attempted to pass through a swamp. The surprised Loyalists scattered after about 5 minutes of fighting. Wayne ordered his men to run down the fleeing enemy and kill them. As the Americans were hacking the enemy with swords and bayonets, the main force charged forward to support the vanguard. The Americans appeared to be caught off guard by this. Wayne, however, was prepared. As the British advanced, a contingent of South Carolina militia cavalry, led by Colonel Wade Hampton, charged out of the woods. The 2 sides collided, resulting in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Men on horseback slashed at each other with their sabers. Wayne's infantry soon arrived brandishing bayonets, and finally Wayne personally led the final charge to break and scatter the enemy. By dawn, the enemy survivors had fled the scene, leaving behind a field of the dead and dying. Following this American victory in February, the Creek withdrew and the British and Loyalists remained behind their defenses in Savannah. For the next few months, the lines remained pretty quiet. The greatest challenge to Wayne's army was deprivation. He could not get any soldiers to join him, and Wayne had been forced, as I said, to leave his Pennsylvania line in South Carolina. Since then, Greene had actually taken back some of the soldiers that had initially accompanied Wayne to Georgia. Wayne found that he had managed to attract only about 90 Georgia militia to join his forces. Greene also refused to provide ammunition or food. Wayne was trying to keep his men from plundering the civilian population for food, since they were trying to get the population's support. In the end, the soldiers were just struggling to feed and clothe themselves. On top of all that, Wayne was suffering from an old leg wound that never healed properly, and that caused him constant pain. He also developed a hacking cough and a pain in his lungs that simply would not go away. The cough caused an even greater pain in his chest, which was the result of another earlier wound, and that just seemed to get worse over time. Wayne attempted to get supplies from the main army in South Carolina, only to be told that the Georgia army was on its own and had to find its own food. Local farmers refused to sell anything in exchange for paper Continental dollars. When Continental foragers took some supplies from a state depot, the civilian government complained that the Continentals were stealing their food. Wayne's response was sort of a sorry not sorry letter that basically said he was sorry he was under the mistaken impression that the people of Georgia wanted the army in their state to fight the enemy. That spring was a particularly wet one, flooding swamps and making most roads nearly impassable. Finally, in May, the rains subsided and the land began to dry up a bit, and life began to get a bit more bearable. Wayne went to sleep on the evening of May 24th, but the camp was woken shortly after midnight with Indian war whoops. A group of Creek warriors scattered the Continental pickets and rushed into the camp. Many of the Continentals panicked and ran into the woods. Wayne quickly mounted his horse and called on his men to rally into formation. He managed to form a line and led a charge back into the enemy. According to one account, the Creek chief, Sijo, rode out in front of his lines to confront General Wayne directly. The two commanders, Sijo on a white horse and Wayne astride a black stallion, clashed together. Wayne slashed at the chief, causing Sijo to fall off of his horse. At that point, the Creek chief fired his rifle, causing Wayne's horse to collapse. The combat ended with the Creek war chief dead. His death caused the Creek warriors to withdraw. Wayne's horse was also dead, but the general himself emerged from the fight largely unharmed. At dawn the following morning, pickets reported a detachment of British infantry and cavalry approaching. The British had hoped to coordinate an attack with their Creek allies. Instead, they found the Creek defeated and scattered. The Continentals charged the enemy, forcing the British to withdraw. Wayne's men chased the enemy column for several miles back to the British lines at Savannah. Although Wayne did not have the forces to overrun the entrenched lines, he allowed his cavalry to ride within sight of the British barricades, and the Americans fired a volley as a reminder to stay behind their lines, and then they retired from the field. Now, a couple of days after all this, which again was in late May, British General Clark and Royal Governor Wright proposed to Wayne a cessation of hostilities as they awaited word of the peace negotiations taking place in France. General Leslie, who was the commander in Charleston of the British armies, made a similar proposal to General Greene around this same time. The American commanders in both cases did not agree to anything, since peace negotiations were not really something that the military officers had authority to discuss. But it was clear just from the discussions that the British were ready to sit tight and wait rather than go on any offensive again. Word reached the British commander, Leslie, around this same time that General Clinton in New York wanted to recall to New York about 1/3 of the 6,000 soldiers who were currently stationed in the South. In response, Leslie had suggested that Savannah be evacuated. Leslie was concerned that removing troops from both Savannah and Charleston would weaken both so that both could be overrun. By giving up Savannah, they could at least keep Charleston secure. Before the British leaders could finalize any decisions, though, word reached Clinton that he was being sent home and that General Guy Carleton was taking command of all the British forces in North America. So while awaiting orders, the British in Savannah and the Continentals just outside the city essentially sat and watched each other for the entire month of June. The British still outnumbered the Continentals, but clearly could not take additional ground. They knew the end was coming, and none of the British apparently saw the need to become the last casualty in a lost cause. Finally, in July, orders arrived from General Carleton to abandon Savannah. With the orders came boats to move the armies and civilians to new locations. Days before the evacuation, a Loyalist contingent rode out under a flag of truce to ask for terms. Wayne offered only that if they volunteered for service in the Continental Army for at least 2 years, he would do his best to seek a civilian pardon for any past offenses, except for murder. It's not clear if any accepted the terms, but Colonel Brown and the bulk of his Loyalists, along with some Indians, prepared to leave the state along with the rest of the British Army. The handover itself seemed to go pretty smoothly. On July 10th, the day before the British evacuation, Wayne issued orders to have the men dressed as respectably as possible and issued orders that no one should enter the town ahead of the main army. The following day, July 11th, the British garrison simply marched out of the city. They moved to the south, boarding several boats to take them downriver to the Atlantic Ocean. Most of the army moved to a temporary area around the lighthouse on Tybee Island. They remained there for a little over a week. Although General Carleton had provided ships for the evacuation, loading those ships took days. In addition to the armies, there were about 2,500 Loyalist civilians and over 4,000 slaves that had to be removed from Savannah. By July 20th, most of the regulars had been crammed aboard 2 sloops, the Zebra and the Vulture, and those ships left for the West Indies. The following day, Brown and his militia took another ship which was going to be bound for St. Augustine. 2 days after that, the Hessians and the remainder of the garrison embarked on a ship that would stop in Charleston, but eventually take them on to New York. Departing with this last group was Royal Governor Wright. He had served as governor for 22 years. As he left behind his governorship, he also had to abandon his 25,000 acres of plantations and many of his more than 500 slaves that he had accumulated over his decades serving as governor. On July 12th, the day after the British left Savannah but were still in the area, preparing to board their ships, Lieutenant Colonel James Jackson led his Georgia militia into Savannah to take possession of the city. The governor had made an agreement to allow Loyalist merchants to remain in Savannah, providing a source of supplies for the population. The Loyalist merchants agreed to remain for at least 6 months in exchange for pardons. By all accounts, the return of Savannah to Patriot control was without violence. The following day, the Georgia Assembly met at Christ Church in Savannah for what was largely a symbolic session to reclaim full control of the independent state of Georgia. General Wayne wrote to General Greene to inform him of the evacuation. Greene responded almost immediately that he wanted Wayne to bring his soldiers to South Carolina so that they could step up pressure on Charleston. Greene was concerned that the British garrison in Savannah might be headed for Charleston in hopes of once again going on the offensive there. Wayne was concerned about leaving before all the British had departed on their ships. He was particularly concerned about reports that the Loyalist Colonel Brown remained just a few miles away with 500 Loyalist soldiers. The last thing Wayne wanted was to march for South Carolina, only to have Brown's Loyalists sack Savannah and kidnap the civilian government. Now, by July 25th, all British and Loyalists were aboard the ships, although many of them remained just off the coast. Colonel Jackson's militia had moved out to Skidway Island, which is just south of Savannah, to observe the departing enemy fleet. There, the British fired on the militia from their boats, forcing the Americans to retreat inland. The British cannons destroyed the buildings on Delagal's plantation, where the militia had first set up their observation post. Although most of the British ships carrying regulars had left, those carrying Colonel Brown and his Loyalists remained. They landed once again on Skidaway Island, and Wayne had to bring his Continentals down to confront them. Now, the Loyalists, of course, were not ready to take on the Continental Army by themselves, so when they saw Wayne's approach, they reboarded their boats and sailed about 6 miles south to Ossabaw Island, which is still in Georgia. They remained there for some time before finally withdrawing to St. Augustine in East Florida. The skirmishing on July 25th would mark the last battle of the war in Georgia. Even so, the Loyalists who were now in Florida were not done. A few weeks later, they returned on a rogue galley to Ossabaw Island, and there they burned a ship that was being built, as well as a plantation belonging to John Morrill. They also seized 33 slaves and 2,000 pounds of indigo. This would be the first of many coastal raids by the Loyalists that would continue for several years. Even before the British evacuation, the Georgia Assembly had begun using a law they passed in early 1782, confiscating the property of Loyalists. Land auctions began to provide desperately needed revenue. Part of this was used to provide a large plantation for General Wayne as the state's thanks for his liberation of the state. Wayne and his Continentals, however, did not hang around for long. In August, they returned to South Carolina, where General Wayne returned to command of the Pennsylvania line, which was around Charleston. Wayne, however, could not take an active command. During his march to South Carolina, he picked up a pretty bad case of malaria. So by the time he reached Greene's camp in Charleston, he was near the point of collapse and could barely stay in his saddle. This illness left General Wayne bedridden for several months. But he had accomplished his task. Georgia was free of British soldiers and Loyalists and was now indisputably a free and independent state. Next week, we're going to follow the Continental Army back up to South Carolina, where General Greene still must contend with his efforts to recapture Charleston. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, Michael Mulhern, and the Sons of the American Revolution. And you can check out the Sons podcast at fastfunhistory.com. I also want to thank Robert Morris Circle supporters on Patreon, Curtis Johnson, and Chasen Harrison. Also, welcome to those who joined on Patreon at the standard bearer level last month: Craig Baracco, William Anderson, Tom Fortner, Tom Peltzer, and Dominic Walker. Each of you, of course, will receive your first monthly flag magnet next month. To anyone who supports the podcast at the level of $10 or more per month receives a different magnet with a flag from the American Revolution each month. I really do appreciate everyone who helps to support this podcast, either through an ongoing contribution on Patreon or through a one-time gift via PayPal or Venmo. Now, also this week is our upcoming American Revolution Roundtable. Our topic will be the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts. This is going to be a live interactive event to discuss the acts of Parliament that pretty directly led to the establishment of the Continental Congress and the outbreak of war. I apologize that I was not able to hold a roundtable last month in May. Too many things got in my way and I just ran out of time. I apologize for that. But we are back on our regular schedule. We meet the second Wednesday of every month. And of course, June 12th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time is the next time that we will be meeting. If you would like to participate in this live event, email me for a link. If you want to receive invitations to future events, be sure to sign up for my mailing list on MailChimp. I send out the link to everybody there. I also send out the link to all my friends on Patreon. If you want to join my mailing list, there's a link at the bottom of each blog episode. Just go to blog.amrevpodcast.com, scroll down to the bottom of any weekly episode, and you'll see a link where you can sign up for MailChimp. This week's topic, the evacuation of Savannah, marks the end of the war for Georgia. It's also the first major evacuation that takes place during the British effort to shut down this war and leave the continent. For loyalists in the colonies, the result came as a bit of a shock. Few had imagined a few years earlier that Britain would be defeated and was going to abandon North America. The result was that many colonists, some of whom had lived in the colonies for generations and had remained loyal to the crown, now had to leave everything behind and find a new home somewhere else in the world. The British government would also end up paying, not only because of the loss of its colonies, but they actually had to reimburse many of the loyalists for their losses. The king had to be seen as taking care of those who had stood loyally by him during this contest, even in defeat. Otherwise, loyalty in future conflicts would be in question. One of those loyalist leaders, Governor Wright, ended up traveling to Jamaica with most of the civilian loyalists who left Georgia in the evacuation. Several thousand loyalists and slaves sailed to Jamaica to start new lives. Another sizable portion headed to St. Augustine in Florida. Some of those slaves leaving Georgia were granted their freedom. Those who had fled patriot masters to support the British were entitled to freedom. The slaves of loyalists, however, remained in slavery. Now, this led to a great deal of conflict, especially when you had slaves that switched hands during the war. Some were seized by patriots, but then became the property of loyalists before the war ended. And so there was a lot of dispute over exactly who got to be free and who remained in slavery. Governor Wright eventually sailed for London. There, he lobbied for himself and on behalf of other Georgia loyalists who wanted compensation from the crown for their losses. Wright actually ended up receiving only a small pension of about £500 a year for his many years of service. He died in Westminster only a few years later in 1785. This was just 3 years after he had had to leave Savannah. Another British leader from Georgia, General Alured Clark, went on to have a pretty active career. When the war ended, he served as lieutenant governor of Jamaica and later became acting governor. In 1791, he transferred to Quebec for a couple of years. He later participated in the British capture of South Africa, and after that, he served as a top military commander in India. By 1830, at the age of 85, Clark was still serving as an officer in the British Army, and he received promotion to Field Marshal and died at home in England about 2 years later. My book recommendation this week is The American Revolution in Georgia, 1763 to 1789, by Kenneth Coleman. This is a pretty extensive look at the war in Georgia from a variety of aspects. The author was a professor at the University of Georgia who's written numerous books about this era, so the book does have a bit of a schoolbook academic feel to it. The book is also an older one, first published in 1958. The author passed away in 1999. If you just want to take a quick look at the book before buying it, there is a borrow-only copy online on archive.org. But if you're interested, in particular, in Georgia's role in the Revolution, get a copy of The American Revolution in Georgia, 1763 to 1789, by Kenneth Coleman. My online recommendation is a rather short PDF document put together by the Sons of the American Revolution on the evacuation of Savannah. It's only 8 pages, but it gives a good and detailed summary of the evacuation itself. As always, there are links to my recommendations on my blog and website. And I'll also remind you that I have compiled an online list of all my former book recommendations and online recommendations, and that list is available on my website. So if you want to go back and find recommendations from past episodes, that's a great place to do it. Just go to www.amrevpodcast.com for more details. My question this week asks, how did the Continental Congress get its name? Well, today we associate the word Congress with legislature. And before the Revolution, that was not the case. A Congress was simply a term for a meeting of various individuals or groups. In modern linguistics, we'd probably use the word convention when we were talking about such a meeting. The men who discussed the matter ahead of time were very mindful of the fact that they did not want to be accused of treason. Forming a separate government in 1774 certainly would have been seen as treason. It was also absolutely not the goal of these men at this time to discuss independence. Basically, in calling for this Congress, they were saying that we want to get together to discuss our concerns about Parliament. The particular focus was on the Coercive Acts, which had recently been passed in response to the Boston Tea Party. Again, that's going to be the topic of our Zoom discussion this week, so if you want to join me for more on that, happy to see you there. These Coercive Acts were designed to reduce colonial protests and take away power from colonial legislatures. One of the most fundamental concerns was the idea that Parliament could change colonial charters at will without any input from the colonists. The leaders were simply suggesting that they get together to discuss a coordinated response to these actions. They recognized that their only hope of challenging British authority was by having a unified response across many colonies. So forming this Congress was simply a way of saying we should get together and discuss a coordinated response. The term Continental was another neutral term that simply described the fact that the meeting will be open to everyone on the continent who wished to attend. Delegates certainly hoped that all British colonies on the continent would send delegations. However, the colonies in what is today Canada, as well as Georgia and East and West Florida, and the island colonies in the West Indies all declined to send delegations. The First Continental Congress even declined to meet in what we call today Independence Hall. At that time, it was the Pennsylvania State House. Meeting in a government building might be seen as a challenge to British sovereignty, which again was absolutely not their goal. Instead, they met in Carpenter's Hall. The First Continental Congress simply petitioned the king and Parliament and did little else. There was also no talk of war or independence at this first Congress. The goal was to create a set of unified demands in their petitions and then consider economic boycotts if Britain refused to consider them. Many who attended this first Congress didn't want to even go that far. They had agreed to the Congress as a way of delaying boycotts that many provincial groups had been already considering implementing. Before the First Continental Congress broke up after just a few weeks, they scheduled a second meeting of their Continental Congress to meet in the spring of 1785. By that time, the British would have time to respond to the petitions that the First Congress sent out, and the Second Congress could decide whether it was appropriate to implement any boycotts. However, by the time the Second Continental Congress met, war had already broken out in Massachusetts, and the Second Continental Congress ended up having to play catch-up. By that time, the delegates, like it or not, found themselves engaged in treason by supporting a war against the British Army. But the neutral name of the Continental Congress had already been accepted and adopted and remained in use. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.